Now, let's all be attentive to Mr. Nye as he gives us his 30-minute presentation.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Ham, I learned something. Thank you. But let's take it back around to the question at hand. Does Ken Ham's creation model hold up? Is it viable? So for me, of course, well, take a look. We're here in Kentucky on layer upon layer upon layer of limestone. I stopped at the side of the road today and picked up just a piece of limestone that has a fossil right there. Now, in these many, many layers, in this vicinity of Kentucky, there are coral animals, fossil, zooxanthellae. And when you look at it closely, you can see that they live their entire lives. They lived typically 20 years, sometimes more than that, if the water conditions are correct. And so we are standing on millions of layers of ancient life. How could those animals have lived their entire life and formed these layers in just 4,000 years? There isn't enough time since Mr. Ham's flood for this limestone that we're standing on to have come into existence. My scientific colleagues go to places like Greenland, the Arctic, they go to Antarctica, and they drill into the ice with hollow drill bits. It's not that extraordinary. Many of you have probably done it yourselves, drilling other things, hole saws to put locks in doors, for example. And we pull out long cylinders of ice, long ice rods. And these are made of snow. And by long tradition, it's called snow ice. And snow ice forms over the winter as snowflakes fall and are crushed down by subsequent layers. They're crushed together and trapping the little bubbles. And the little bubbles must needs be ancient atmosphere. There's nobody running around with a hypodermic needle squirting ancient atmosphere into the bubbles. And we find certain of these cylinders to have 680,000 layers. 680,000 snow, winter, summer cycles. How could it be that just 4,000 years ago, all of this ice formed? Let's just run some numbers. This is some scenes from lovely Antarctic. Let's say we have 680,000 layers of snow ice and 4,000 years since the Great Flood. That would mean we'd need 170 winter, summer cycles every year for the last 4,000 years. I mean, wouldn't someone have noticed that? Wow. Wouldn't someone have noticed that there's been winter, summer 170 times one year? If we go to California, we find enormous stands of bristlecone pines. Some of them are over 6,000 years old, 6,800 years old. There's a famous tree in Sweden, Old Tycho, is 9,550 years old. How could these trees be there if there was an enormous flood just 4,000 years ago? You can try this yourself, everybody. I don't mean to be mean to trees, but get a sapling and put it underwater for a year. It will not survive in general, nor will its seeds. They just won't make it. So how could these trees be that old if the Earth is only 4,000 years old? Now, when we go to the Grand Canyon, which is an astonishing place, and I recommend to everybody in the world to someday visit the Grand Canyon, you find layer upon layer of ancient rocks. And if there was this enormous flood that you speak of, wouldn't there have been churning and bubbling and roiling? How would these things have settled out? Your claim that they settled out in an extraordinary short amount of time is, for me, not satisfactory. You can look at these rocks, you can look at rocks that are younger, you can go to seashores where there's sand. This is what geologists on the outside do, study the rate at which soil is deposited at the end of rivers and deltas, and we can see that it takes a long, long time for sediments to turn to stone. Also, in this picture, you can see where one type of sediment has intruded on another type. Now, if that was uniform, wouldn't we expect it all to be even without intrusion? Furthermore, you can find places in the Grand Canyon where you see an ancient riverbed on that side, going to an ancient riverbed on that side, and the Colorado River has cut through it. And by the way, if this great flood drained through the Grand Canyon, wouldn't there have been a Grand Canyon on every continent? How could we not have Grand Canyons everywhere if this water drained away in this extraordinary short amount of time, 4,000 years? Now, when you look at these layers carefully, you find these beautiful fossils. And when I say beautiful, I am inspired by them. They're remarkable because we are looking at the past. You find down low, you'll find what you might consider as rudimentary sea animals. Up above, you'll find the famous trilobites. Above that, you might find some clams, some oysters. And above that, you'll find some mammals. You never, ever find a higher animal mixed in with a lower one. You never find a lower one trying to swim its way to the higher one. If it all happened in such an extraordinary short amount of time, if this water drained away just like that, wouldn't we expect to see some turbulence? And by the way, anyone here, really, if you can find one example of that anywhere in the world, the scientists of the world challenge you. They would embrace you. You would be a hero. You would change the world if you could find one example of that anywhere. People have looked and looked and looked. They have not found a single one. Now, here's an interesting thing. These are fossil skulls that people have found all around the world. It's by no means representative of all the fossil skulls that have been found, but these are all over the place. Now, if you were to look at these, I can assure you not any of them is a gorilla, right? If, as Mr. Ham and his associates claim, there was just man and then everybody else, there were just humans and all other species, where would you put modern humans among these skulls? How did all these skulls get all over the earth in these extraordinary fashion? Where would you put us? Well, I can tell you we are on there, and I encourage you, when you go home, to look it up. Now, one of the extraordinary claims associated with Mr. Ham's worldview is that this giant boat, very large wooden ship, went aground safely on a mountain in the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East. And so places like Australia are populated then by animals who somehow managed to get from the Middle East all the way to Australia in the last 4,000 years. Now, that to me is an extraordinary claim. We would expect then, somewhere between the Middle East and Australia, we would expect to find evidence of kangaroos. We would expect to find some fossils, some bones. In the last 4,000 years, somebody would have been hopping along there and died along the way, and we'd find them. And furthermore, there's a claim that there was a land bridge that allowed these animals to get from Asia all the way to the continent of Australia, and that land bridge has disappeared in the last 4,000 years. No navigator, no diver, no U.S. Navy submarine, no one's ever detected any evidence of this, let alone any fossils of kangaroos. So your expectation is not met. It doesn't seem to hold up. So let's see, if there are 4,000 years since Ken Ham's flood, and let's say, as he said many times, there are 7,000 kinds. Today, the very, very lowest estimate is that there are about 8.7 million species, but a much more reasonable estimate is it's 50 million or even 100 million when you start counting the viruses and the bacteria and all the beetles that must be extant in the tropical rainforest that we haven't found. So we'll take a number which I think is pretty reasonable, 16 million species today, okay? If these came from 7,000 kinds, that's, let's say we have 7,000 subtracted from 15 million, that's 15,993. We have 4,000 years, we have 365 and a quarter days a year. We would expect to find 11 new species every day. So you'd go out into your yard, you wouldn't just find a different bird, a new bird, you'd find a different kind of bird, a whole new species of bird every day, a new species of fish, a new species of organisms you can't see, and so on. I mean, this would be enormous news. The last 4,000 years, people would have seen these changes among us. So the Cincinnati Enquirer, I imagine, would carry a column right next to the weather report. Today's new species, and it would list these 11 every day. But we see no evidence of that. There's no evidence of these species. There just simply isn't enough time. Now, as you may know, I was graduated from engineering school, and I got a job at Boeing. I worked on 747s. Okay, everybody relax. I was very well supervised. Everything's fine. There's a tube in the 747 I kind of think of as my tube. But that aside, I traveled the highways of Washington State quite a bit. I was a young guy. I had a motorcycle. I used to go mountain climbing in Washington State, Oregon. And you can drive along and find these enormous boulders on top of the ground. Enormous rocks, huge, sitting on top of the ground. Now, out there in regular academic pursuits, regular geology, people have discovered that there used to be a lake in what is now Montana, which we charmingly refer to as Lake Missoula. It's not there now, but the evidence for it, of course, is, if I may, overwhelming. And so an ice dam would form at Lake Missoula, and once in a while it would break. It would build up and break, and there were multiple floods in my old state of Washington State. And but just before we go on, let me just say, go Seahawks. That was very gratifying for me. Anyway, you drive along the road, and there are these rocks. So if, as is asserted here at this facility, that the heavier rocks would sink to the bottom during a flood event, the big rocks, and especially their shape, instead of aerodynamic, the hydrodynamic, the water-changing shape as water flows past. You'd expect them to sink to the bottom. But here are these enormous rocks right on the surface, and there's no shortage of them. If you go driving in Washington State or Oregon, they're readily available. So how could those be there if the Earth is just 4,000 years old? How could they be there if this one flood caused that? Another remarkable thing I'd like everybody to consider, inherent in this worldview, is that somehow Noah and his family were able to build a wooden ship that would house 14,000 individuals. There are 7,000 kinds, and there's a boy and a girl for each one of those. So it's about 14,008 people. And these people were unskilled. As far as anybody knows, they had never built a wooden ship before. Furthermore, they had to get all these animals on there, and they had to feed them, and I understand that Mr. Ham has some explanations for that, which I frankly find extraordinary, but this is the premise of the bit. And we can then run a test, a scientific test. People in the early 1900s built an extraordinarily large wooden ship, the Wyoming. It was a 6-masted schooner, the largest one ever built. It had a motor on it for winching cables and stuff. But this boat had a great difficulty. It was not as big as the Titanic, but it was a very long ship. It would twist in the sea. It would twist this way, and this way. And in all that twisting, it leaked. It leaked like crazy. The crew could not keep the ship dry. And indeed, it eventually foundered and sank, loss of all 14 hands. So there were 14 crewmen aboard a ship built by very, very skilled shipwrights in New England. These guys were the best in the world at wooden shipbuilding. And they couldn't build a boat as big as the Ark is claimed to have been. Is that reasonable? Is that possible? That the best shipbuilders in the world couldn't do what 8 unskilled people, men and their wives, were able to do? If you visit the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., it's 163 acres, and they have 400 species. By the way, this picture that you're seeing was taken by spacecraft in space, orbiting the Earth. If you told my grandfather, let alone my father, that we had that capability, they would have been amazed. That capability comes from our fundamental understanding of gravity, of material science, of physics, and life science, where you go looking. This place is often, as any zoo, is often deeply concerned and criticized for how it treats its animals. They have 400 species on 163 acres, 66 hectares. Is it reasonable that Noah and his colleagues, his family, were able to maintain 14,000 animals and themselves and feed them aboard a ship that was bigger than anyone's ever been able to build? Now, here's the thing. What we want in science, science as practiced out on the outside, is an ability to predict. We want to have a natural law that is so obvious and clear, so well understood, that we can make predictions about what will happen. We can predict that we can put a spacecraft in orbit and take a picture of Washington, D.C. We can predict that if we provide this much room for an elephant, it will live healthily for a certain amount of time. So I'll give you an example. In the explanation provided by traditional science of how we came to be, we find, as Mr. Ham alluded to many times in his recent remarks, we find a sequence of animals in what generally is called the fossil record. This would be to say, when we look at the layers that you would find in Kentucky, you look at them carefully, you find a sequence of animals, a succession. And as one might expect, when you're looking at old records, there's some pieces seem to be missing, a gap. So scientists got to thinking about this. There are lungfish that jump from pond to pond in Florida and end up in people's swimming pools. And there are amphibians, frogs and toads, croaking and carrying on. And so people wondered if there wasn't a fossil or an organism, an animal that had lived, that had characteristics of both. People over the years had found that in Canada, there was clearly a fossil marsh, a place that used to be a swamp, had dried out. And they found all kinds of happy swamp fossils there, ferns, so on, organisms, animals, fish that were recognized. And people realized that if this, with the age of the rocks there, as computed by traditional scientists, with the age of the rocks there, this would be a reasonable place to look for an animal, a fossil of an animal that lived there. And indeed, scientists found it, Tiktaalik, this fish lizard guy. And they found several specimens. It wasn't one individual. In other words, they made a prediction that this animal would be found, and it was found. So far, Mr. Ham and his worldview, the Ken Ham creation model, does not have this capability. It cannot make predictions and show results. Here's an extraordinary one that I find remarkable. There are certain fish, the top minnows, that have the remarkable ability to have sex with other fish, traditional fish sex, and they can have sex with themselves. Now, one of the old questions in life science, everybody, one of the old sort of chin strokers, is why does any organism, whether you're an ash tree, a sea jelly, a squid, a marmot, why does anybody have sex? I mean, there are more bacteria in your tummy right now than there are humans on Earth. And bacteria, they don't bother with that, man. They just like split themselves in half. They get new bacteria. Like, let's get her done. Let's go. But why does think of all the trouble a rose bush goes to make a flower, and the thorns and the bees swimming, flying around, interacting. Why does anybody bother with all that? And the answer seems to be your enemies. And your enemies are not lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, no. Your enemies are germs and parasites. That's what's going to get you. Germs and parasites. My first cousin's son died tragically from essentially the flu. This is not some story I heard about. It's my first cousin once removed. Because apparently the virus had the right genes to attack his genes. So when you have sex, you have a new set of genes. You have a new mixture. So people studied these top minnows, and they found that the ones who reproduced sexually had fewer parasites than the ones that reproduced on their own, this black spot disease. Wait, there's more. In these populations, with flooding and so on, with river ponds get isolated, then they dry up, then the river flows again. In between, some of the fish will have sex with other fish sometimes, and they'll have sex on their own, what's called asexually. And those fish, the ones that are in between, sometimes this, sometimes that, they have an intermediate number of infections. In other words, the explanation provided by evolution made a prediction. And the prediction's extraordinary and subtle, but there it is. How else would you explain it? And to Mr. Ham and his followers, I say this is something that we in science want. We want the ability to predict. And your assertion that there's some difference between the natural laws that I use to observe the world today and the natural laws that existed 4,000 years ago is extraordinary and unsettling. I travel around. I have a great many family members in Danville, Virginia, one of the U.S.'s most livable cities. It's lovely. And I was driving along, and there was a sign in front of a church, Big Bang Theory, you got to be kidding me, God. Now, everybody, why would someone at the church, a pastor, for example, put that sign up unless he or she didn't believe that the Big Bang was a real thing? I just want to review briefly with everybody why we accept, in the outside world, why we accept the Big Bang. Edwin Hubble, oh, sorry, there you go. You got to be kidding me, God. Edwin Hubble was sitting at Mount Wilson, which is up from Pasadena, California. On a clear day, you can look down and see where the Rose Parade goes. It's that close to civilization. But even in the early 1900s, the people who selected this site for astronomy picked an excellent site. The clouds and smog are below you. And Edwin Hubble sat there at this very big telescope night after night studying the heavens. And he found that the stars are moving apart. The stars are moving apart. And he wasn't sure why, but it was clear that the stars are moving farther and farther apart all the time. So people talked about it for a couple decades. And then eventually another astronomer, almost a couple decades, another astronomer, Fred Hoyle, just remarked, well, it was like there was a Big Bang. There was an explosion. This is to say, since everything's moving apart, it's very reasonable that at one time they were all together. And there's a place from whence these things expanded. And it was a remarkable insight. But people went still questioning it for decades. Science and conventional scientists questioning it for decades. These two researchers wanted to listen for radio signals from space, radio astronomy. And this is, while we have visible light for our eyes, there's a whole nother bunch of waves of light that are much longer. The microwaves in your oven are about that long. The radar at the airport is about that long. Your FM radio signals about like this. AM radio signals are a kilometer. They're several soccer fields. They went out listening, and there was this hiss, this tss, all the time that wouldn't go away. And they thought, oh, doggone it, there's some loose connector. They plugged in the connector. They re-screwed it. They made it tight. They turned it this way. The hiss was still there. They heard it that way. It's just still there. They thought it was pigeon droppings that had affected the reception of this horn, it's called. This thing is still there. It's in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. It's a National Historic Site. And Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson had found this cosmic background sound that was predicted by astronomers. Astronomers running the numbers, doing math, predicted that in the cosmos would be left over this echo, this energy from the Big Bang that would be detectable. And they detected it. We built the Cosmic Observatory for Background Emissions, the COBE spacecraft, and it matched exactly the astronomers' predictions. You got to respect that. It's a wonderful thing. Now, along that line is some interest in the age of the Earth. Right now, it's generally agreed that the Big Bang happened 13.7 billion years ago. What we can do on Earth, these elements that we all know on the periodic table of chemicals, even ones we don't know, were created when stars explode. And I look like nobody, but I attended a lecture by Hans Bethe, who won a Nobel Prize for discovering the process by which stars create all these elements. The one that interests me especially is our good friends rubidium and strontium. Rubidium becomes strontium spontaneously. It's an interesting thing to me. A neutron becomes a proton, and it goes up the periodic table. When lava comes out of the ground, molten lava, and it freezes, turns to rock, when the melt solidifies or crystallizes, it locks the rubidium and strontium in place. And so by careful assay, by being diligent, you can tell when the rock froze. You can tell how old the rubidium and strontium are, and you can get an age for the Earth. When that stuff falls on fossils, you can get a very good idea of how old the fossils are. I encourage you all to go to Nebraska, go to Ashfall State Park, and see the astonishing fossils. It looks like a Hollywood movie. There are rhinoceroses, there are three-toed horses in Nebraska. None of those animals are extant today, and they were buried catastrophically by a volcano in what is now Idaho, is now Yellowstone National Park. What's called the hot spot, people call it the super volcano. And it's a remarkable thing. Apparently, as I can tell you, as a Northwesterner around for Mount St. Helens, full disclosure, I'm on the Mount St. Helens board. When it goes off, it gives out a great deal of gas that's toxic and knocks these animals out. Looking for relief, they go to a watering hole, and then when the ash comes, they were all buried. It's an extraordinary place. Now, if in the bad old days you had heart problems, they would right away cut you open. Now we use a drug based on rubidium to look at the inside of your heart without cutting you open. Now, my Kentucky friends, I want you to consider this. Right now, there is no place in the Commonwealth of Kentucky to get a degree in this kind of nuclear medicine, this kind of drugs associated with that. I hope you find that troubling. I hope you're concerned about that. You want scientifically literate students in your Commonwealth for a better tomorrow for everybody. You can't get this here. You have to go out of state. Now, as far as the distance to stars, understand this is very well understood. It's February. We look at a star in February, we measure an angle to it, we wait 6 months, we look at that same star again, and we measure that angle. It's the same way carpenters built this building. It's the same way surveyors surveyed the land that we're standing on. And so by measuring the distance to a star, you can figure out how far away it is, that star, and then the stars beyond it and stars beyond that. There are billions of stars, more than 6,000 light years from here. A light year is a unit of distance, not a unit of time. There are billions of stars. Mr. Ham, how could there be billions of stars more distant than 6,000 years if the world's only 6,000 years old? It's an extraordinary claim. There's another astronomer, Adolf Kittel, who remarked first about the reasonable man. Is it reasonable that we have ice older by a factor of 100 than you claim the Earth is? We have trees that have more tree rings than the Earth is old. That we have rocks with rubidium and strontium and uranium and potassium argon dating that are far, far, far older than you claim the Earth is. Could anybody have built an ark that would sustain better than any ark anybody was able to build on the Earth? So if you're asking me, and I got the impression you were, is Ken Ham's creation model viable? I say no, absolutely not. Now, one last thing. You may not know that in the U.S. Constitution, from the Founding Fathers, is the sentence to promote the progress of science and useful arts. Kentucky voters who might be watching online in places like Texas, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Kansas, Please, you don't want to raise a generation of science students who don't understand how we know our place in the cosmos, our place in space, who don't understand natural law. We need to innovate to keep the United States where it is in the world. Thank you very much.
That's a lot to take in. I hope everybody's holding up well. It's a lot of information. What we're going to have now is a 5-minute rebuttal time for each gentleman to address the other one's comments, and then there will be a 5-minute counter-rebuttal after that. Things are going to start moving a little more quickly now. So at this point in particular, I want to make sure we don't have applauding or anything else going on that slows it down. So, Mr. Ham, if you'd like to begin with your 5-minute rebuttal first.
Well, first of all, Bill, if I was to answer all the points that you brought up, the moderator would think I was going on for millions of years. So I can only deal with some of them. And you mentioned the age of the Earth a couple of times, so let me deal with that. As I said in my presentation, you can't observe the age of the Earth, and I would say that comes under what we call historical origin science. Now, just to understand, so you understand where I'm coming from, yes, we admit we build our origins of historical science on the Bible. The Bible says God created in 6 days. The Hebrew word yom, as it's used in Genesis 1 with evening, morning number, means an ordinary day. Adam was made on day 6. And so when you add up all those genealogies specifically given in the Bible, yeah, from Adam to Abraham, you've got 2,000 years from Abraham to Christ, 2,000 years from Christ to the present 2,000 years. That's how we get 6,000 years. So that's where it comes from, just so you know. Now, a lot of people say, now, by the way, the Earth's age is 4.5 billion years old, and we have radioactive decay dating methods that found that. But you see, we certainly observe radioactive decay, whether it's rubidium, strontium, whether it's uranium, lead, potassium, argon. But when you're talking about the past, we have a problem. I'll give you a practical example. In Australia, there were engineers that were trying to search out about a coal mine, and so they drilled down and they found a basalt layer, lava flow, that had woody material in it, branches and twigs and so on. And when Dr. Andrew Snelling, our PhD geologist, sent that to a lab in Massachusetts in 1994, they used potassium argon dating. It dated to 45 million years old. Well, he also sent the wood to the radiocarbon section of the same lab, and that dated to 45,000 years old. 45,000-year-old wood and 45 million-year-old rock. The point is, there's a problem. Let me give you another example of a problem. There was a lava dome that started to form in the 80s after Mount St. Helens erupted. And in 1994, Dr. Steve Austin, another PhD geologist, actually sampled the rock there. He took whole rock, crushed it, sent it to the same lab, actually, I believe, and got a date of 0.35 million years. When he separated out the minerals, amphibole and pyroxene, and used potassium argon dating, you get 0.9 million, 2.8 million. My point is, all these dating methods actually give all sorts of different dates. In fact, different dating methods on the same rock we can give all sorts of different dates. See, there's lots of assumptions in regard to radioactive dating. Number one, for instance, the amounts of the parent and daughter isotopes at the beginning when the rock formed. You have to know them, but you weren't there. See, that's historical science. Assumption two, that all daughter atoms measured today must have only been derived in situ radioactive decay of parent atoms. In other words, it's a closed system, but you don't know that, and there's a lot of evidence that that's not so. Assumption number three, that the decay rates have remained a constant. And they're just some of them. There's others as well. The point is there's lots of assumptions in regard to the dating method. So there's no dating method you can use that you can absolutely age date a rock. There's all sorts of differences out there. And I do want to address the bit you brought up about Christians believing in millions of years. Yeah, there's a lot of Christians out there that believe in millions of years, but I'd say they have a problem. I'm not saying they're not Christians, but because salvation is conditioned upon faith in Christ, not the age of the earth, but there's an inconsistency with what the Bible teaches. If you believe in millions of years, you've got death and bloodshed, suffering, disease over millions of years leading to man, because that's what you see in the fossil record. The Bible makes it very clear death is a result of man's sin. In fact, the first death was in the garden when God killed an animal, clothed Adam and Eve, first blood sacrifice, pointing towards what would happen with Jesus Christ, who would be the one who would be die once and for all. Now, if you believe in millions of years as a Christian, in the fossil record, there's evidence of animals eating each other. The Bible says originally all the animals and man were vegetarian. We weren't told we could eat meat until after the flood. There's diseases represented in the fossil record, like brain tumours, but the Bible says when God made everything, it was very good. God doesn't call brain tumours very good. There's fossilised thorns in the fossil record. Instead of being hundreds of millions of years old, the Bible says thorns came after the curse. So these two things can't be true at the same time. And you know what? There's hundreds of dating methods out there, hundreds of them. Actually, 90% of them contradict billions of years. And the point is, all such dating methods are fallible. And I claim there's only one infallible dating method. It's a witness who was there, who knows everything, who told us. And that's from the Word of God. And that's why I would say that the Earth is only 6,000 years. And as Dr. Faulkner said, there's nothing in astronomy, and certainly Dr. Snelling would say there's nothing in geology to contradict a belief in a young age for the Earth and the universe.
Thank you, Mr. Ham. Mr. Nye, your 5-minute rebuttal, please.
Thank you very much. Let me start with the beginning. If you find 45 million year old rock on top of 45,000 year old trees, maybe the rock slid on top. Maybe that's it. That seems much more reasonable explanation than it's impossible. As far as dating goes, actually the methods are very reliable. One of the mysteries or interesting things that people in my business, especially at the Planetary Society, are interested in is why all the asteroids seem to be so close to the same date. It's in age, 4.5, 4.6 billion years. It's a remarkable thing. People at first expected a little more of a spread. So I understand that you take the Bible as written in English, translated not countless, but many, many times over the last 3 millennia, as to be a more accurate, more reasonable assessment of the natural laws we see around us than what I and everybody in here can observe. That to me is unsettling, troubling. And then about the disease thing, are the fish sinners? Have they done something wrong to get diseases? That's sort of an extraordinary claim that takes me just a little past what I'm comfortable with. And then as far as you can't observe the past, I have to stop you right there. That's what we do in astronomy. All we can do is in astronomy is look at the past. By the way, you're looking at the past right now because the speed of light bounces off of me and then gets to your eyes. And I'm delighted to see that the people in the back of the room appear just that much younger than the people in the front. So this idea that you can separate the natural laws of the past from the natural laws that we have now, I think is at the heart of our disagreement. I don't see how we're ever going to agree with that if you insist that natural laws have changed. It's, for lack of a better word, it's magical. And I have appreciated magic since I was a kid, but it's not really what we want in conventional mainstream science. So your assertion that all the animals were vegetarians before they got on the ark, that's really remarkable. I have not spent a lot of time with lions, but I can tell they've got teeth that really aren't set up for broccoli. That these animals were vegetarians till this flood is something that I would ask you to provide a little more proof for. I give you the lion's teeth. You give me verses as translated into English over, 30 centuries? So that is not enough evidence for me. If you've ever played telephone, I remember very well in kindergarten, where you have a secret and you whisper it to the next person, to the next person, to the next person. Things often go wrong. So it's very reasonable to me that instead of lions being vegetarians on the ark, lions are lions, and the information that you use to create your worldview is not consistent with what I as a reasonable man would expect. So I want everybody to consider the implications of this. If we accept Mr. Ham's point of view that, Mr. Ham's point of view, that the Bible as translated into American English serves as a science text, and that he and his followers will interpret that for you. I want you to consider what that means. It means that Mr. Ham's word, or his interpretation of these other words, is somehow to be more respected than what you can observe in nature, what you can find literally in your backyard in Kentucky. It's a troubling and unsettling point of view, and it's one I'd very much like you to address when you come back. As far as the 5 races that you mentioned, it's kind of the same thing. The 5 races were claimed by people who were of European descent, and they said, hey, we're the best, check us out. And that turns out to be, if you've ever traveled anywhere or done anything, not to be that way. People are much more alike than they are different. So are we supposed to take your word for English words translated over the last 30 centuries instead of what we can observe in the universe around us?
Very good. And Mr. Ham, would you like to offer your 5-minute counter rebuttal?
First of all, Bill, just so I just don't want a misunderstanding here, and that is the 45,000-year-old wood, or supposedly 45,000, was inside the basalt. So it was encased in the basalt, and that's why I was making that particular point. And I would also say that natural law hasn't changed. As I talked about, I said we have the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, and that only makes sense within a biblical worldview anyway, of a creator God who set up those laws. And that's why we can do good experimental science, because we assume those laws are true, and they'll be true tomorrow. I do want to say this, that you said a few times, Ken Ham's view or Ken Ham's model. It's not just Ken Ham's model. We have a number of PhD scientists on our own staff. I had video quotes from some scientists. It's Dr. Damadian's model. It's Dr. Fabish's model. It's Dr. Faulkner's model. It's Dr. Snelling's model. It's Dr. Purdam's model. And so it goes on. In other words, and you go on our website, and there are lots of creation scientists who agree with exactly what we're saying concerning the Bible, concerning the Bible's account of creation. So it's not just my model in that sense. There's so much that I could say, but as I listen to you, I believe you're confusing terms in regard to species and kinds, because we're not saying God created all those species, we're saying God created kinds, and we're not saying species got on the ark, we're saying kinds. In fact, we've had researchers working on what is a kind. For instance, there's a number of papers published on our website where, for instance, they look at dogs and they say, well, this one breeds with this one, with this one, with this one, this one, this one, and you can look at all the papers around the world and you can connect them all together and say that obviously represents one kind. In fact, as they've been doing that research, they have predicted probably less than actually 1,000 kinds were on Noah's Ark, which means just over 2,000 animals, and the average size of a land animal is not that big. So, there was plenty of room on the Ark. I also believe that a lot of what you were saying was really illustrating my point. You were talking about tree rings and ice layers, and just talking about kangaroos getting to Australia and all sorts of things like that. But see, we're talking about the past when we weren't there. We didn't see those tree rings actually forming. We didn't see those layers being laid down. In 1942, for instance, there were some planes that were landed on the ice in Greenland, and they found them, 46 years later, I think it was, 3 miles away from the original location with 250 feet of ice buried on top of them. So ice can build up catastrophically. If you assume 1 layer a year or something like that, it's like the dating methods. You're assuming things in regard to the past that aren't necessarily true. In regard to lions and teeth, most bears have teeth very much like a lion or tiger, and yet most bears are primarily vegetarian. The panda, if you look at its teeth, you'd say maybe it should be a savage carnivore. It eats mainly bamboo. The little fruit bat in Australia has really sharp teeth, looks like a savage little creature, and it rips into fruit. So just because an animal has sharp teeth doesn't mean it's a meat eater, it means it has sharp teeth. And so again, it really comes down to our interpretation of these things. I think too, in regard to the Missoula, example that you gave, you know, creationists do believe there's been post-flood catastrophism. Noah's flood certainly was a catastrophic event, but then there's been post-flood catastrophism since that time as well. And again, in regard to historical science, why would you say Noah was unskilled? I mean, I didn't meet Noah, and neither did you. And, you know, really, it's an evolutionary view of origins, I believe, because you're thinking in terms people before us aren't as good as us. Hey, there are civilizations that existed in the past, and we look at their technology, and we can't even understand today how they did some of the things that they did. Who says Noah couldn't build a big boat? By the way, the Chinese and the Egyptians built boats. In fact, some of our research indicates that some of the wooden boats that were built had 3 layers interlocking so they wouldn't twist like that and leak, which is why here at the Creation Museum we have an exhibit on the Ark where we've rebuilt 1% of the Ark to scale and show 3 interlocking layers like that. And one last thing concerning the speed of light, and that is, I'm sure you're aware of the horizon problem, and that is from a Big Bang perspective, even the secularists have a problem of getting light and radiation out to the universe to be able to exchange with the rest of the universe to get that even microwave background radiation. On their model, 15 billion years or so, they can only get it about halfway, and that's why they have inflation theories, which means everyone has a problem concerning the light issue. There's things people don't understand, and we have some models on our website by some of our scientists to help explain those sorts of things.
Very good. Mr. Nye, your counter rebuttal.
Thank you, Mr. Ham, but I'm completely unsatisfied. You did not, in my view, address just fundamental questions. 680,000 years of snow ice layers, which require winter-summer cycle. Let's say you have 2,000 kinds instead of 7. That makes the problem even more extraordinary. Multiplying 11 by by 3.5, we get to 35, 40 species every day that we don't see. They're not extant. In fact, you probably know we're losing species due to mostly human activity and the loss of habitat. Then, as far as Noah being an extraordinary shipwright, I'm very skeptical. The shipwrights, my ancestors, the Nye family in New England, spent their whole life learning to make ships. I mean, it's very reasonable, perhaps, to you that Noah had superpowers and was able to build this extraordinary craft with 7 family members. But to me, it's just not reasonable. Then, by the way, the fundamental thing we disagree on, Mr. Ham, is this nature of what you can prove to yourself. This is to say, when people make assumptions based on radiometric data, when they make assumptions about the expanding universe, when they make assumptions about the rate at which genes change in populations of bacteria in laboratory growth media, they're making assumptions based on previous experience. They're not coming out of whole cloth. So next time you have a chance to speak, I encourage you to explain to us why we should accept your word for it, that natural law changed just 4,000 years ago, completely, and there's no record of it. You know, there are pyramids that are older than that. There are human populations that are far older than that, with traditions that go back farther than that. And it's just not reasonable to me that everything changed 4,000 years ago. By everything, I mean the species, the surface of the earth, the stars in the sky, and the relationship of all the other living things on earth to humans. It's just not reasonable to me that everything changed like that. And another thing I would very much appreciate you addressing, there are billions of people in the world who are deeply religious, and I respect that. People get tremendous community and comfort and nurture and support from their religious fellows in their communities, in their faiths, in their churches, and yet they don't accept your point of view. There are Christians who don't accept that the earth could somehow be this extraordinarily young age because of all the evidence around them. And so, what is to become of them, in your view? And by the way, this thing started, as I understand it, Ken Ham's creation model is based on the Old Testament. So when you bring in, I'm not a theologian, when you bring in the New Testament, isn't that a little out of the box? I'm looking for explanations of the creation of the world as we know it, based on what I'm going to call science. Not historical science, not observational science. Things that each of us can do, akin to what we do. We're trying to outguess the characters on murder mystery shows, on crime scene investigation especially. What is to become of all those people who don't see it your way? For us in the scientific community, I remind you that when we find an idea that's not tenable, that doesn't work, that doesn't fly, doesn't hold water, whatever idiom you'd like to embrace, we throw it away. We're delighted. That's why I say if you can find a fossil that has swum between the layers, bring it on. You would change the world. If you could show that somehow the microwave background radiation is not a result of the Big Bang, come on, write your paper, tear it up. So your view that we're supposed to take your word for this book written centuries ago, translated into American English, is somehow more important than what I can see with my own eyes is an extraordinary claim. And for those watching online especially, I want to remind you that we need scientists and especially engineers for the future. Engineers use science to solve problems and make things. We need these people so that the United States can continue to innovate and continue to be a world leader. We need innovation, and that needs science education. Thank you.
All right, thank you both.